housing market is digesting Canada's first rate cut. And of course, there are hopes, or at least the housing industry hopes, that buyers who've been holding off will re-enter the market. Could these rate cuts mean lower rents in Canada as well? Our guest says it'll take more than just reductions in borrowing costs to bring down rentals. Let's bring in Ricardo Tranjan, political economist and senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you very much for joining us. I suppose at first blush you might think, well, a landlord's carrying cost for a project will come down with lower rates and it'll cost less to build new rental housing if interest rates come down. But you think, no, this won't necessarily mean a break for renters.
Well, we might have an impact on the decision of a developer to start new projects or not start those projects, hold back for a little bit more, and that might have an impact on the overall quantity of units in the market in a few years from now. But for tenants who have been hit with increases in the rent, the calculation more from the landlord perspective, it's what's the mortgage right now, and if it has increased in costs, whether they can pass those additional costs to tenants. Once they pass it, it's locked in, rents are not gonna go down, they're gonna, at least at the very best, they're gonna just stabilize.
And you argue that in previous periods of low interest rates, we didn't see a break for renters.
No, actually what we see over time, it's when interest rates peak, rents peak soon after, within 12 months or so. And again, that's landlords who have higher costs trying to pass it on tenants. Sometimes, honestly, it may be the landlords that don't necessarily have a higher cost because the buildings are already paid for or because they're on a 10-year mortgage, but they have a good excuse to do so. They have an opportunity to increase rents, and they would just seize that opportunity to increase the revenues. But then when interest rates, come back down, rents stabilize. What really kind of held back rents a little bit in our last really high inflation period, which was in the early 1980s, was the rent controls that the federal government put in place through the provinces. That helped to help back a little bit, but it wasn't an automatic process. It required government intervention.
What is causing higher rents then? What has caused this exponential increase in the price?
Well, it's a combination of two factors. Often we erroneously think about landlords and rents as a standard business, right? You have a cost and you put a little margin of profit there, and then you have the total cost of it for the consumer. But more and more, for the very large landlords and for the small ones, they're thinking more as investors. So we have to think in terms of opportunity costs here. They're thinking about how much more they could make from this investment. They're comparing not only the absolute, their gains in absolute terms, but they're comparing in relative terms with other potential investments. So they are trying to maximize that. In a scenario which is for most of Canada, where rent controls are fairly weak and they can increase more, they will go and get that more. So we have seen now in Canada, the rents for vacant units are now going up by an average of 22%. In Toronto, they went up by 40%. And that is, again, investors being able to maximize on that opportunity to increase their revenues.
So is it simplistic to say if we vastly increase the supply of rental housing, it would bring down rents?
No, it won't. It won't. That is, it's a common myth that it's all a matter of imbalance of supply and demand. It's much more complicated than that. It's a fairly poorly regulated market of an essential good. So you give a lot of leverage to the investors to keep pushing the profit margins up. So what we really need is to bring some more regulations in place to tame that temptation of profiteering and these excess profits. And absolutely, we need to continue to build housing. And there's a really good debate about what kinds of housings we build and where we build. There's the need to upzone some of these the urban centers that we have. They're only zoned right now for single detached home, and that doesn't make sense. We need to bring more housing to those spaces because they're well served by infrastructure and so on. So there's a really good debate about how to build more housing. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient to bring rents down. To bring rents down, you would have to increase the supply, but also bring forward some regulations that will tame all of that profiteering that is happening right now in the market. There's a lot of people making a lot of good money with rent right now, too much money, and you only become more affordable if there's some way to avoid that.
Obviously, our politicians generally say we want to involve the private sector in building this rental housing. Is that possible, or do we just have to have taxpayer-funded rental buildings?
Most people will argue that we need a mix of both. What we have now, and this has honestly been documented since the early 1940s. Back then, the chief researcher for the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation wrote this very comprehensive document that said, you know what, the market will not deliver affordable housing to low to moderate income households. We will need a different model. Market housing will never be affordable for that segment of the population. We will need non-market housing. We will need public housing. We need forms of co-op housing. And again, in these types of housing, sometimes what we do require some state, some government funding to get the projects off the ground. But people do pay rent, and the projects do pay for themselves. So it's not the same kind of program investment year after year like education and health. We need to invest in infrastructure, and then we need to bring like non-market housings or municipal governments and co-ops to run those projects. And the literature shows that that's the housing that actually delivers affordable housing to low and moderate income households.
So just finally, sorry, I know you touched on this point, but if there was a huge increase in rental housing provided by the public and private sector, say it was a mixed model, wouldn't that just create much greater availability and landlords would have to cut the rents they're charging?
Yes, for availability, you would. And that's an important aspect of it. You want people to have choice. You want to be able to move to closer to work, closer to the daycare, and so on and so forth. And prices would likely stabilize. You would likely see less aggressive rent increases. But at the point that they're right now, and how much they're consuming of how much rent consumes of average household income, that would still kind of not be sufficient to make housing truly affordable for a lot of the working class families. So yes, it would increase availability. Yes, it would put less pressure on rents and kind of stabilize a little bit increases. But I would continue to see increases that may outpace inflation if there's no rent controls in place. And you're definitely not going to see anything becoming more affordable than it is right now.